So welcome to our third session of today. We're going to finalize our discussion of culture as a fundamental determinant of long-run economic growth. And we also finalize our semester here with this last lecture. So we already discussed the belief systems, and we already discussed some of the values that affect factor accumulation and innovative capacities and innovative realizations of a society. I'm going to continue with a utility function approach. So I'm going to talk briefly about preferences. So let's imagine a society where there are children and their parents. Okay, so parents. So the timing is like this. So if this is one period, such as this is period 0, so there are some people here. These are adults and they have kids, right? So these adults die at the end of this period and these kids become adults, okay? So then we have the next period, right, T1. Again, they have kids, these die, and they become adults. And that continues, all right, at T equals 2 and goes on like this. So at each T, adults take certain decisions, all right? So what are these decisions? One decision is in terms of consumption, okay? So this is the consumption of the adult, all right? Another decision is about working, right? So suppose that these people care about the time so they have 1 unit of time. LT is the labor supply, 1 minus LT is leisure, all right? They also care about how many kids they have, okay? They also care about what will their kids human capital, okay? They may also care about other stuff, okay? Now, each of these, so actually let's put a parameter here, such as alpha. Now realize that these parameters does not have to be equal across agents, right? So if there are different parents, suppose that this is the population at T, right? So there are NT adults. These agents can differ, right? And it can also, so these parameters can also change in time, all right? From one generation to the next. So our agents may have different number of kids. They attach different utilities to their kids' human capital. And by the way, of course, human capital will be determined by this function, such as, so it will depend on the education spending and human capital of the parents. So there could be other determinants, but let's keep it simple in this way, right? So what happens if this person I maximizes utility by choosing consumption, labor supply, and the education spending, right? So here, the utility maximization is with respect to consumption, fertility, labor supply, and education spending in the simplest case, right? So it turns out that with some budget constraint, of course, right? You will also, so this is one constraint. And the second constraint here is some sort of a budget constraint, right? So there will be consumption for each kid. There is education spending. For each kid, there is a cost of raising those kids. And this will be depend on the income, right? So income could have other resources that are exogenous and there could be even other stuff, right? So if you solve such a problem, you will find that in general, so if this is the parameter vector, right, of agent at T, so there are all the parameters inside this vector, right? So then the optimal choices, right, these are now optimal choices, will depend on these parameters and depend on other variables in the model, right? Labor supply will depend on that. So in general, fertility will depend on that, right? And education spending will depend on that. So as you see, preferences, even if we look at only the consumer side, right? Only the households behavior, so parents taking certain decisions about fertility, taking certain decisions about the education spending on their kids, certain decisions about labor supply and consumption. Even in that case, there is this huge complexity running towards these preference parameters, all right? Now, in the simplest models, we assume that these preference parameters are fixed. So we assume that theta fixed and exogenous, but in reality, it changes across people. So there is heterogeneity, and also it changes across time. And in fact, there are theories that shows that this parameter vector evolves from generation to generation by depending on certain other choices as well. Okay, so as I discussed earlier, one reason is that people socialize their kids in their own values, right? So if I am a hardworking parent, I have this natural tendency to make my kid also a hardworking agent when he or she becomes an adult. If I attach a large value to my kids' human capital, if I really do care about education, then I socialize my kids according to these values as much as possible, even if it is costly. So then there is higher likelihood that my kid would also attach higher utilities to my grandkids' education, right? So this is one way of understanding how culture evolves, right? So we go at the individual level as, you know, obedient neoclassical economists. So we go at the level of the individual and we characterize the preferences of individuals by making them endogenous, right? So we are making them endogenous and time changing so we can understand the long run changes in values and attitudes and all of this stuff. So you can now put religion into this. You can put pessimism into this. If the model becomes a stochastic model, then there are uncertain events, and you should take some sort of expectation to take decisions. Now, when we do that, so how can preferences matter? Well, let's think of risk aversion first, right? So suppose that we define utility as a function of money we have, all right? So M is for money, right? So if this utility function is strictly concave, all right, so let me draw a strictly concave utility function, then so I know that this is strictly concave because you know that from your math class, right? So if I take the average of these 2 points, for some reason I cannot draw it. So if I take some midpoint between 2 points, right, the function evaluation is larger than the average of these, the weighted average of these utility levels. So in that case, this function is strictly concave, right? So if the function is strictly concave, we call these agents risk averse, right? So the preference parameter here could be modeled in this way. So suppose that this utility function is like this. Okay, so how can we make this concave? Well, if you take the first derivative, what do you have? You have m to the sigma minus 1, right? And if you take the second derivative, I have sigma minus 1 m to the sigma minus 2. So how can this function become strictly concave? Well, if sigma is less than 1, right, the second derivative is negative, so then this function becomes strictly concave. But then different levels of sigma across two different agents, for instance, right, would give you different degrees of risk aversion, right? Because they will have different utility functions now. So one of them will be like this, the other would be like this, for instance, right? So the curvature will differ, then risk attitude will differ across two agents. Now, another important thing is how we discount the future, right? Time preferences. So time preferences matter. Now, in a dynamic model, suppose that I want to care about my consumption today. Okay, I am agent I, this is my utility. Okay, so I care about consumption today, and I also care about consumption tomorrow. Okay, but I have this parameter here, rho I, right? Now, if rho I was 0, then there is no time discounting, right? So here I am attaching with positive rho, right? I'm attaching, so this is no discounting case. So here, if rho is positive, which is the typical assumption, right? The utility attached for the future consumption is lower, right? So this is, if this is the utility I attach to today's consumption, right? This is the utility I attach to tomorrow's consumption. Okay, so these are consumption levels, and these are the utility levels attached, the weights of utilities attached to consumption levels at different dates, right? Because now I have time preferences. I have certain preferences on when I'm going to consume my resources, right? So now, why is that important? Because it affects my savings, right? It affects my savings. If I attach larger utilities, for tomorrow's consumption, that would most possibly increase my saving rate. Now, in the logarithmic case, the situation is not actually the case. So let me put this here. So V is some utility function. So I want to be perfectly consistent with what I'm saying, right? So there is some utility function. The utility function does not change. Be careful, right? The V function is the same at t and t plus 1, but the marginal utility changes, right? Marginal utility for the same consumption level is different. So this is because of discounting assumption. So rho means So higher levels of rho means less patience, right? Because if I increase rho, I decrease the utility weight I attach to tomorrow's consumption, and that would decrease my saving rate. I care more about today's consumption. Okay. Then once again, you can imagine that this is actually time dependent. Okay. And there is also a paper that actually says, so it is not only time dependent, okay, that discount rate rho is not only time dependent, but it also depends on your wealth. Okay? So if you become wealthier, what would it be? You would be less patient or more patient? I think it is safe to say that both are possible, right? But my intuition suggests that if I get wealthy and wealthy, if my wealth accumulates, perhaps I can be more patient, right? So you may or less patient. So again, this is, but there are papers that endogenizes such dynamics as well, and then you may even go further and say it changes in time according to a transition function, right? So that depends on the existing level, your wealth, the average wealth in the society, and so on. Okay, so this is how culture in one particular domain may actually be evolving, right? Now, one other thing was altruism, right? And I already kind of talked about this when I write this utility function that depends on, the key. So agent utility function depends on the kid's human capital, right? So gamma here is the altruism parameter. But more generally, we would like to write this in this form, right? So there is this utility of agent I, and then there is the utility of the kid, right? So we would want to define the utility of parent in this way. So first, this is the period utility. Okay, so I obtain as an agent, as a parent, I obtain this period utility when I am alive. And then this is my kid's period utility, right? And this is the altruism factor, altruism parameter. Okay, so as you see, sorry, so this is not, okay, so this is one way of defining it, but usually we define it in this way, right? So my period utility plus the altruism factor times my kid's utility, okay? So this is my welfare, let's say, right? And this is my period utility. So this is parent, this is parent, and this is the kid's welfare. Okay? So this is called Bellman equation, but you don't have to deal with it. Just try to understand it. So the altruism factor is important because my kid's welfare is part of my welfare. Okay? And it doesn't have to be the kids, right? Why? Well, it may be my own parents, right? So I'm taking a decision so I care about my period utility. Then there are two altruism parameters. One altruism parameter at T is for my child's, okay? And another altruism parameter is for my parents. Now, how to solve this problem? Well, of course, it requires for you to understand how my parents behave. So there is a strategic, again, interaction between generations. So here, if I only look at this, then it is easier because now I am only looking at the future. But here, if I have some way to change my parents' own utility, right, because they are still alive, so I can transfer resources to my parents, such as in the case of old age security, then the situation is getting even more complex. So altruism, and it doesn't have to be exactly within the family, right? I also care about my friends. I also care about my students. I also care about my neighbors, and so on and so forth. Okay. So that's all I'm gonna say about culture. As you realize, if you think about this, you realize that all of these cultural elements are important, have important implications for long-run growth through physical capital accumulation, through wealth accumulation, through technological progress, and through human capital accumulation. So it is all related with such preferences, with such values and attitudes and risk preferences and pessimism and religion and being secular or not, or so on and so forth. And geography is an important element. So how cold is the weather? How large is the agricultural, areas? How large is the main elevation in the country? So these are some of the important geographical features that might have some cultural effects. And there's also institutions. So both political and economic institutions are important for interacting with culture. So culture affects institutions, institutions affect culture. As we all know, I mean, just look at the last 200 years of Turkish economic history, and you see what do I mean by that. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. You have about 6.5 minutes for questions and comments.
Sorum yok ama teşekkürler hocam. Tüm dönem, tüm sene için.
Rica ederim.
Evet hocam, teşekkürler. Çok güzel bir seneydi yani.
Öyle mi?
Evet.
İnşallah. İnşallah.
Yüz yüze olsa daha güzel olurdu ama.
Ha?
Yüz yüze olsa tabii ki daha güzel olurdu ama ne yapalım?
Yüz yüze olsa çok iyi olurdu, evet. Bu da fena olmadı. En azından canlı ders yaptık ama okulda olmamak bence de yani tercih edilir bir şey değil. Şu hastalıktan bir an önce kurtulursak okula dönmeyi sabırsızlıkla bekliyoruz.
Evet.
Ofisimizde.
Eylül'de görüşürüz belki hocam.
Umarım görüşmeyiz. Siz 4 değil misiniz?
Biz 3
Ben
hocam.
3. sınıfım hocam.
Yani üçler de var.
Üçler de var hocam, evet. Umarım
Tamam.
görüşürüz Eylül'de hocam. Açılır da.
Umarım görüşürüz.
Bu dönem için çok teşekkür ederiz. Verimli bir dersti. Emekleriniz için çok sağ olun hocam.
Rica ederim. Siz de katıldığınız
Evet
için ben
hocam,
teşekkür
çok
ederim.
teşekkürler.
90 öğrenci içinde aralıksız katılan, herhalde hiç kaçırmayan var mı? Ben hiç ders kaçırmadım diyen var mı?
Hocam
Hocam
ben
benimki
sadece.
Dolayısıyla
Üçüncü
90
sınıflarda bir de çakışma oluyordu hocam. Ondan kaynaklı da bazen şey oluyor. Uluslararası dersi vardı bizim.
Şimdi en çok gelen ve simasına aşina olduğum Hacer ve Betül. Onlar çünkü kamera açıp ders dinliyorlar. Şimdi onlar bile en az bir kez gelmediyse demek ki 90 küsur öğrenci var. Herkes en az bir kez gelmemiş. Yani o anlaşılıyor. Çünkü
Ama
hiç
sonra
gelmeyen var. Eminim hiç gelmeyen var. Ya şeye hiç bağlanmayan var ya uzun süredir.
Bu zaman mi?
Bu
görünüyor
zaman.
onlar girmedi falan diye.
Her şeyi görüyorum. Ne zaman girdiğinizi, ne zaman çıktığınızı, kaç dakika harcadınız. Ya oturup bakmıyorum tabii de. o kadar onunla ilgilenecek zamanım yok ama
Gittiniz
yani
artık.
yani şeye bakacağım mesela şimdi 49'da kalmış. Değil mi final notu? Yani dönem sonu notu bir arkadaşınızın 49 diyelim. Şimdi girip bakacağım yani ne yapmış diye. Ya da ya 49 belki geçer de hani 47'ye bakacağım yani. Dolayısıyla doğru düzgün final kağıtları verin. Tamam.
Hocam yine vize gibi mi olacak finalde?
Bilmiyorum, düşünmedim henüz.
Hocam,
Önce o bütün şeyleri okumak istiyorum. Bir göreyim.
okudunuz mu onları diyecektim.
Yok, okumadım maalesef. Okuyamadım daha doğrusu. Okuyacağım ama. 4 Haziran değil mi bizim finalimiz? 4 Haziran'dan önce açıklamış olacağım, merak etmeyin.
Tamamdır hocam.
Tamam, görüşmek üzere o zaman. Kendinize iyi bakın.
Görüşmek
Bize
üzere.
Görüşürüz
hocam.
hocam. Kendinize iyi
Kendinize
bakın. Siz de.
Duyuruları takip edersiniz.
Tamamdır hocam.
Evet.
Hocam,
Efendim,
Ankara'da mısınız şu an?
şu an Ankara'da değilim, hayır.
Gelmeyecek misiniz hocam Ankara'ya hiç?
Geleceğim. Aslında gelecektim de başka bir şey çıktı, gelemedim. Yani önce yasaklar girdi, sonra da başka bir şey çıktı. Çok yakın zamanda geleceğim ama.
Hocam gelirseniz biz hep Ankara'dayız. Sizi görmeye geliriz okula falan.
Tamam, mesafeye dikkat edin de.
Tamam, ben uzaktan el sallarım size pencereden falan hocam.
Tamam, Beytepe'ye uğrarsanız tabii ki, yani Beytepe'ye giderseniz uğrayın, görüşelim.
Tamam hocam, görüşürüz.
Tamamdır. O zaman hepinize iyi günler. Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşürüz hocam. Kendinize iyi bakın.
İyi günler hocam.
Görüşmek
Görüşürüz.
üzere hocam.
Bye bye.